This is Saturday, June 17th of 2017. And we're going to take a look at the tools for dodging and burning and the typical dodge and burn layer, which is an independent layer for your image. So let's go up to the File, Open command, navigate to where Saturday, June 17th is, and I put the images all in a folder called Tutorial Images. And we're going to look at Dodge Burn Waterfall and Snickerdoodle Sponge, which is left over from another week. Dodge Burn Waterfall and Snickerdoodle Sponge, and open them. This was a discovery, I believe, we made together, but I thought I would mention it, that in general, my feeling about the tools that come over here in the tool panel, the ones that are either dodge and burning or sponge, or they're all best when used on very small areas. I would never use them for large jobs. And we sort of, without intending it, discovered last week that we could lighten the shadowed faces by using a dodge tool and not doing it on a separate layer. So well, I shouldn't say not on a separate layer, but go ahead over here and find the Dodge and Burn series, which either looks like the sponge tool, it's in the Enhanced Group and Elements, and or it's in a separate place. Let me just make this not cover it up. Okay, down there are 3 tools in this group, and this is the tool that burns in. That would make things darker. This is the dodge tool, and dodging traditionally makes things lighter. It goes back to the day when people were exposing in a dark room, and if they wanted it to be less dark, they took their hand under the exposure and flicked their hand back and forth to cut down on the light, and to burn was to enhance it. So dodging and burning are with sponge. So let us grab the dodge. So I always end up going to Window, Images, Float All, no, Consolidate All to tabs. That means I can choose whichever image I want to work on. I'm going to bring Snickerdoodle up. And if you'll notice that this tool does not have an option to look at all the layers, and that's because you have to work directly on a pixel layer. And we know to do that, we make a copy of the background. You can do it by going to Layer, Duplicate Layer, or you can use Command or Control J. Either will give you a duplicate layer, and that means, and I'm going to call this Dodge simply because that's what I'm going to do on it. You all know that you don't have to name this layer if you don't want to. So I have a layer, and the reason for doing that is if I mess up, I can delete that layer and I'm back with my untouched image. So I'm over here, and I want you to notice that you have a choice here as to what you're going to dodge in the range. You can choose shadows, midtones, or highlights. Okay? And so you have to kind of decide if we're going to lighten this, whether it's best doing shadows or midtones. And if you're not sure, you can always try one and undo it if it doesn't work. But let's choose the shadows. That will have more of an effect on this image than if we were to use midtones. So let's choose shadows as what we're trying to lighten. The brush is going to, by default, be soft, which is what we want. And the exposure is the one you can control, and that says how quickly do you want to change this image. I keep that exposure somewhat low. If I was to find that my setting was too abrupt a change, I can undo my last action and lower the exposure. Let's try somewhere around 30% as what we're going to do. So now we can look carefully. Are we on the duplicate layer? Yes, we are. And we have the Dodge tool, and we have it set for shadows. We size it according to how big it needs to be in that image. Now, this image is a tiny screenshot, so it's already at 100%. You'll notice later in the morning we'll use higher resolution images. If I think it's hard to work on that little kid's face, I can still make it larger. I can go to the zoom tool and zoom in. You realize it's a little less sharp, but it's still easier if it's bigger. So I zoomed in, and when you zoom, that means you've changed tools. So you come back down to your dodge tool, and all the settings are the same. And whenever I use these tools, I remember that as long as my mouse button stays down, I can go over that area as much as I want. And I've only applied 31% lightening. Once I lift my finger off the mouse button, put it down again, another 31% is removed. So don't lift your finger. Go over here, lighten it, and when you think it's done, I could keep going over that, and it shouldn't have any effect unless I lift my mouse button. And of course, I look at it right away and I say, it's too much. Well, I could either lower opacity here, or let's redo. How do you undo the last step? You can either go to Edit, Undo, or you see it's Command or Control Z if you like to use the keyboard. I can undo it and say that was too light. So exposure, I'm going to bring it down to about 20%, and I'm going to try it again. See, that appeals to me more. And do I want to see the before and after? I come up to that layer and I hide the eyeball, and there's the change. For a tiny area like that, that may work. But what we learned last week is that you can also use the sponge tool and get more color back into the face. You see how white the face looks? If you want to, you've lightened it. Now if you'd like to give color to it, you can come over and go to the sponge tool next to it. And you don't want to desaturate, you want to saturate. And going over it, whoa, look, you certainly have to change your size to be appropriate for it. And one swipe on that same thing will bring back the color to the face. So for a tiny area, it's really kind of useful and a lot quicker. So I'm going to say this boy could have the same effect on it. So I'm going to go first, and I'm going to use the dodge tool on the shadows, and I'm going to apply them over his face. And then I'm going to go down and change to the sponge tool, and I'm going to do the same thing with the sponge tool. And now I can see both of those faces in the window. If I go up and undo that by hiding that layer and come back, I can see the change. And of course, I might very well touch up this face. If I do this face, I've got to be careful that I don't lighten the area over here. So I want you to recognize that when you use dodge and burn like this, you must be very precise as to where you apply it to your picture, because there's nothing choosing which pixels you're going to affect. So you really have to be very touchy, and that's why we're going to see the benefit in dodging and burning using a dodge and burn layer. So I guess my recommendation is, if you have an image where there's a tiny area that needs to be lightened, you might very well use that dodge tool for that tiny area, but make sure you're not working on the original background, that you're in on a copy of the background. Okay. Now, just as an aside here, when I've created a copy of that background for a tiny little correction that in no way am I ever going to go backwards on, once I'm satisfied with my results, I'm willing to merge that layer back to the background, something I almost never do. But the function of that extra layer is so minor, and it doubles the file size. I say, might I want to come back and undo that? If I do, I want to keep it. But if this is something where I'm never going to go backwards, I'm perfectly satisfied with that correction, then it's all right to go up to the Layers panel and choose any of these. I only have one layer on top of the background. Merging down will merge that one layer down. which is the same thing as flattening the image, and it's absolutely the same thing as merging visible. This means any eyeball that's active here, turned on, will get merged. So some people say, what is the difference between those? In this case, no difference. But if I had 8 layers and I wanted to merge 1 layer only, the fastest way is to merge that 1 layer down, or to unclick the eyeball of any layer that I don't want to merge. Okay? So that we usually are flattening images. That means all the layers are being flattened into one background. The only reason I would do that is if the work I did on this layer is never going to get undone. In other words, there's no question in my mind that I want to go backwards. Then I don't need to keep that layer. Normally, I keep that layer. If there's any possibility, I might want to go back another day and undo it or redo it. Okay. So in this case, you don't have to do it right now.
I understand but what's the difference between merging visible and flatten?
Merging visible says if I had 7 layers here on this image, and I did not want to flatten all the layers into the background, I just wanted to merge some of them together. Any layer that has a visible eyeball will get merged.
Oh, so if you have an X through the eyeball, it won't be
That's right. If you close off the eyeball, then it won't be merged. Yeah. Right. There's very special places you might use it. Most times we don't do that. But in this case, any of them would do the same thing. They're all equal use. Okay, I'm going to suggest that we just close this layer and don't save it. So close down Snickerdoodle. Don't save it, because you can play with it later. That will bring up Dodge and Burn Waterfall. When you have an image where there's a lot of lightning you want to do, and you would like to do it in various areas of darkness, there are several ways of dodging and burning with the separate layer. The traditional way, which we'll do first, is to create a dodge and burn layer and paint on that layer black to darken and white to lighten. That's the traditional way. And to get that by the old method, to add that dodge and burn layer, we would go in and get a neutral layer. So go to the top of the layers panel in Elements or the bottom in Full Photoshop, find the torn piece of paper and click it. We now need to fill that layer with 50% gray. So we're going to come over to Edit, Fill Layer, and when the window comes up, you want to choose not the foreground color, but 50% gray. Can you see that option on the thing? So you're in Edit, Fill Layer, and in the window that pops up, it says Use. And you can pop that open and choose 50% gray. It'll probably indicate foreground, background, or you could set it to white, or you could set it to black. But when you set it to 50% gray and say OK, you want to be able to see through that layer. To see through it, you need to change the blend mode. So pop that blend mode open to either overlay or soft light. And overlay tends to be stronger. Soft light tends to be more gentle. I'll give you some of Tony Kuiper's thoughts later about that. So click Overlay. You now have not hidden the image at all. And the word is, if you have an overlay or a soft light blend mode over a 50% gray layer, you have not affected the original image at all. But it gives you a layer where you can either lighten or darken parts of the underlying layer. So we're going to take this is not the preferred new way, so we're not going to spend too long. So we're going to go and it's active. The layer, the dodge and burn layer is active. And if you are, like to keep records on things, you click on double click the name, and you can name that Dodge Burn. Just so later on, if you looked at it, you'd know that's what you did on that layer, but you don't need to name it. So I'm going to come over and take a paintbrush. So if you look over in the draw group here, I have a paintbrush, brush tool. Letter B will find it if you don't know where it is. And down here, becomes critical, the foreground, background color. The paintbrush always paints with the foreground color. If I want to darken an area, I want to paint with black. If I want to lighten an area, I want to paint with white. I'm going to start lightening this very dark area over here. So I'm going to switch the black and white. How do we work with these tools? If they are green and orange and you need black and white, which are the default colors, you can type the letter D for default, or you've got a black and white option in the corner here. And if you click black and white here, you'll get the original default. So if you had purple and green, you can go back to black and white here. And if you have the wrong color on top, in this case I want white on top, I either click an X on the keyboard to exchange, or I hit the little double arrow, and that exchanges them. So this is how we work with that part of the screen always. So I now have a brush, and it's white for lightening. And over here, I want to be sure that it's a soft brush. And remember, we said last week, the shortcut for making a brush harder or softer is to use our larger, smaller brush brackets, but hold down the Shift key. So if you will grab your Shift key on your laptop, and then come up to the keyboard to the letter P where we find the bracket keys, and notice that if you type the left bracket key, it gets softer. If you type the right bracket key, it gets harder. Do back and forth for a bit till you see. You have a lot more variations of soft and hard by doing it this way than by pulling down the menu and just choosing soft or hard.
Can you redo that?
Sure, I'm glad to do that. In order to change the softness of a brush from the keyboard, you hold down the Shift key and go to the right and left bracket keys on your keyboard. They are next to the letter P. And if you keep the Shift key down and you play with the left bracket key, your brush gets softer. And if you play with the right bracket key, it gets harder. And you can see it as you do it. So if you are wanting at any time to soften or harden a brush, this is the fastest way to make changes on that. So as long as it's soft, we're fine. Soft means that what you do will fade out to the edge of the area as you brush. Your brush strokes will be strongest in the center, and they will fade out along the edges, which makes them blend in beautifully with the background. So let's see what we've done. We have a brush. It's set to white. It's soft. And the opacity I keep low so I can gradually build up the change. So I have mine at about 25% opacity. I then take my brush over the dark area, and it's far too small. So now I use the right and left bracket without the Shift key. By using the right bracket by itself, my brush gets bigger. So I get it to the appropriate for the size of the area. And once again, once you press your mouse button down, don't lift it till you've covered the area you want to paint. So I'm coming over and painting this area, and I'm painting it just once at 25%. And when I think I've covered that area, I lift my mouse button. What is the before and after? Go up to the Dodge Burn layer and hide it. And notice how you've lightened it. Okay? Notice what happened to the actual layer. It became softly white, didn't it? And that soft white is because it was 25% opacity. And if you work at a low opacity and that's not enough, you can do it again and you'll get 25% brighter. So if I think I might like to go over this area, I can go over this area once more and skip the area that I think is bright enough and lift my mouse button and notice that I brightened the bottom part of that spot, not the top because I didn't brush over it. I'm then going to go over to the crack here in the deep shadows, and my brush is too big. Left bracket key, make it smaller. Keep the mouse button down once you start dragging, because then I can go over it several times to be sure I didn't miss any. And then I can lift my mouse button, and you see how I've changed that layer. If I want to look at the changes in the layer, I'm paying attention now to the new area. It's going to show everything, but this is what I'm wondering about. I hide that layer, and I come back. Okay. Now, I want you at this point to notice that if I decide to lighten the shadows here, it's not quite as easy because I have both bright and dark pixels in there. If I lighten over this part, I have to recognize that the light part of the water is going to get brighter. So if I'm using this method and I want to work on this area, it's a little tricky. So I'm going to try it. Holding my mouse button down, I'm going to lighten this, and then I got to lift my mouse button and come up here. So I want you to see it gets tricky to paint when you have mixtures of dark and light like over here. So what we're going to do is show you a different way of doing this, but we're not going to lose this layer. We're simply going to hide it. So hide the dodge and burn layer. Okay? And now we're going to use the magic of Tony Kuiper. So with it hidden, I want you to go to the action panel, and in one click, I want you to get a dodge burn layer. Can you see that one of his actions is called burn dodge layer? And you can't hit, if you hit the yellow, it opens it and you get a blue triangle. The blue triangle is what you want to click once. And in order to play that action, you go to the little triangle that is the play button and you play it. And guess what? In one click, you have the dodge and burn layer that you had to go through all that work to get before. And his preference is to make it be automatically soft light instead of overlay. And if you want to change it, it's right there. His preference is soft light. And what I've learned is that the suggestion is if you're lightening something, use soft light. If you're darkening something, use overlay. That's just a recommendation because when you lighten things, it can be a bit harsh. So I'm going to try this, leave it at soft light the way it was. And now I want to do one more thing. The problem I had here was that I only wanted to lighten the dark parts, but these bright water bubbles got in the way. So I'm going to use one of his, let me hide that. I'm going to use one of his selections. So find TK selections and open that. And we're going to say, well, what degree of lightness or darkness am I going to work on? So I'm going to say, well, I'm certainly working on the darks, and shadow darks 3 are pretty well described. If you have a fairly dark shadow, if you say, I only want to select the dark shadows to be affected, I click on the selections. Be sure you're in the selections group for Shadow Darks 3 and play it. And up will come all the crawling ants that are picking just the dark pixels. And we want to work through this selection as we burn. And so for my feeling, these are just a nuisance to see. And you may remember, without losing the selection, we can hide the nasty crawling ants. And the way you hide them is with either Control or Command and the letter H for hide. So on a Mac, it's a Command. On a Windows, it's Control. Hold that key down and type in H. You have not lost the selection. You've only hidden the nasty crawling ants. And now, if I go and I dodge with this white color over that layer, the only part that will be affected is the shadows. So I'm going to size my brush accordingly, and I do still have white, and I'm going to come in here and I'm going to go through at my 25%. And I don't have to worry very much about where I reach. I can come through here and go up and down here. I can go over here and I'd be pretty sloppy about it. I can do this part down here. And anywhere that I think is dark shadows that need lightening, and I don't have to be fussy. And then we're going to see what happens between the two methods. All right. I want to see what happened when I did my dodging up here on this Tony Kuiper layer. So I'm going to hide the background layer and look at that looks like. Can you see how it skipped over the parts that were too bright? Can you see that on my waterfall it actually did not affect the bright water? Because his selection chose just the dark shadows to be affected. And when I painted through his selection, it skipped all the bright areas that I painted over, and it only affected the areas that I chose to see. Now, I want you to bring back the picture. That means see background layer, bring it back. I want you to hide the Tony Kuiper layer and bring back the original Dodge and Burn layer. Now hide the background. Look how just absolutely sloppy painting we did. Anything our brush went over was affected. And so when you dodge and burn like this, you've got to be extremely careful where you put your brush, because everything you brush over is affected. Whereas when you add a selection of Tony Kuiper's, you are pre-selecting the part of the image you want to change, and the rest stays hidden. And it does it in a gradual way so that it isn't abrupt. You'll notice if let's go back and bring back Tony Kuiper's and hide the other one. Okay, so I want you to notice the difference here, how it picks up the part of the picture I designated to change. Now, I want us to keep this lousy dodge and burn layer hidden. We're not going to look at that. But bring back the background so you see your image. The next challenge, I want to darken the brightest part of this image. But I want to be careful that I only darken the sections that need it. Don't want to darken everything. So I'm going to repeat my job before. I'm going to make a new dodge and burn layer with the action panel. So I'm going to close my big group of selections and find Burn Dodge. And if I open it, I get the blue check in front of Burn Dodge layer. I click it and play it with the play button. And you'll notice right away I have the Burn and Dodge layer that is all set to soft light. And you can always play with that, but let's for the time being not worry about the settings. Just be aware, if you want to see a stronger effect on what you did, you move to overlay. If you want a gentle effect, you stay at soft light. So for the moment, we're just going to stay with soft light. And we're going to say now it's time to pick the brighter pixels that I want to darken. I do not want to work over and darken everything in that image. So I have to get a selection. So I'm going to go back to TK selections and I'm going to say, what are the brightness or darkness levels? Well, I want to work on the lights, but I want to work on strong lights. Like, this area down here, I don't need to make a change in this level of lights. It's mostly this. So I'm probably going to go down more defined than plain 1. Let's, for this point, try light lights 2. That says the ones that are just a little bit brighter won't be affected, but the ones that are brighter than that will be affected. So we're going to try light lights 2, and we're going to play that selection. And you see how it has selected the areas it thinks needs to be changed. Now, one tremendous benefit in dodging and burning is, if I decide I don't want to change the ones over here at all, I just don't paint over them. I can only paint over the areas I really want to change, even though it found some layers over here that fit in the selection. If I don't want to change them, I just won't paint over them, and it won't make any difference. So what do I do next? I want to go and hide the crawling ants. So that's Command or Control H. Okay. And then I'm going to go and take my tool, and since I want to darken, I need to change the foreground color to black. So it's either X or the bent arrows. And then I, once again, want to work very delicately at a low opacity, knowing I can paint more than once if I want a greater effect. And I already have my soft brush, and I'm on the burn and dodge layer, and I am working through the selection. How do I know? I can bring it back, Command or Control H. Huh, it's still there. Command or Control H. Now I'm going to paint where I think it needs to be darkened. So I'm going to gently go over the areas that I want to be darkened. And if I think it didn't do enough, I lift my finger and do it again. In other words, if the opacity was too low, I just do it more than once. And I stop occasionally to see what have I done. I come up to that layer and I hide it and I bring it back. Can you see how I brought it down? And it's up to me to decide what needs to be brought down. If I think that probably this is too bright here, I can paint over that area and bring it down. And I am not darkening other areas around it because they were not in the selection. If I look at it and say, well, maybe it is a little too bright up here in the green, I can paint over it and bring it down just as little or as much, depending on how many times I take my brush over. And look at this one. I don't have to be meticulous about the size of the brush because the brush will only affect the selected pixels. And if you'll notice that I have marks on here from where I have been working. So let's check the work before and after. And again, if you think in your situation that you want to bring it down more, you just paint again over the area. And since I'm painting at a low opacity, it's a very gradual change. And because I'm working through a mask, or a selection in this case, I don't have to worry whether I accidentally hit an area like this. It won't darken that area down again because that area is not selected. I selected the brighter part of the tones, and they're the only ones that are affected. So if you look here, I've done a lot of darkening in this corner because it's pure black. It's just very lightly affected in the other areas. So now the major check is the before and after of the entire image. To do that, you go to the original background, and when you point to the eyeball, you hold down your Alt or Option key, and that will hide every layer above. Oh, let's see. Oh, it didn't bring this one back, sorry. In order for that to work, you must first reveal all the layers. I don't know, we don't want the junk layer, do we? The first dodge and burn. That was the one that we said didn't do a good job. Keep the first dodge and burn layer hidden. I don't want to see that one. We tried it and it was sloppy. I just want to see these two layers that I did. So I go down to the bottom, I hold this, and I bring it back.
What's this?
Okay, the eyeball to the background layer, the original layer on the bottom. And if I hold the Alt Option key and I click it, I'll set the original image back to where it was. Okay? And it's very delicate. This was not, but most times we look at an image. We don't want to grossly change the whole thing. But we say the light was lousy in this picture. It had harsh light on one part of the waterfall, deep shadow in the other. And I want to balance the lighting without overdoing it and making it a different image. So again, I can Alt-click to get the before, and look at the waterfall on the left, and then I can bring it back. And now my eye can check the very dark shadows, and they're very slightly changed, but they're changed. So I hope you can see the benefit in doing dodging and burning through a luminosity selection, because it makes it a very precise job you're doing instead of an extremely gross one where everything you touch is changed. I'm wondering if we could perhaps bring back this top layer and hide the bottom. Yes. Okay. Reveal the top layer, hide everything else. And now you see where you did your dodging and burning with black. Can you see how carefully it skipped over the the dark shadows here? And it only darkened the bright areas that were selected? And even over here where I didn't do much, can you see how it only picked up the brights and didn't touch the rest? This is the quality of burning and dodging through a luminosity selection. Your work is so fine-tuned, and it avoids the gross changes that occur where you have worked on this. Let's see. No, this is the one. This is my original one. Can you see how gross this is in comparison? Everything I brushed over was changed, whereas in the others, it only changed the tonality I chose to work on.